I slammed the door to my room violently yet again, and barricaded myself inside. It became something I would do regularly after my father started to delve deeper into all kinds of religious cults. It all started after my mother died 5 years before, when he started claiming that he wanted to become closer to God. I did not give much attention to it, and having my own mental battles to fight, I did not really care. Soon, however, the regular churches did not seem to do enough for him. He started frequenting all kinds of cults that he'd initially praise for days and talk obsessively about, only to leave them a few months later, shunning them and complaining about how they were not devout enough. The cycle ended when he found yet another cult, the cornucopia of paradise. It all began as usual, with him coming home with a smile on his face. Then he would tell me how he'd finally found his place and meaning in the world and describe every single aspect of the cult's ideology. This time, however, my general passive attitude and my falsified approving nods started to anger him. It was the first cult he managed to stay in for an extended period of time. I tried to find out information about this organization he was into, but there was close to nothing to be found on the internet. All I could find was that they were worshipping some sort of persona or deity called Vitris, and that its goals were to instate some sort of paradise on Earth. Just some poorly written amateur articles with many exclamation marks said some things about rumored kidnappings conducted by the cult, but nothing was confirmed, and they seemed written by people who just wanted to gain some attention online. My father would leave for extended periods of time on short notice, if there was any at all, and I assumed he was going to all sorts of events and rituals organized by the cult. It only took a few months before he started insisting I should come to the cult's meetings, and that it should be a priority for me to ascend into its ranks. I tried my best to be evasive where I could, but he would press on until I was forced to refuse directly, which would quickly light up a screaming match. Eventually, the heated arguments would degenerate, and he would attempt to grab and hit me. Whenever I'd escape to my room, there was still a chance I'd be hit by a flying chair or whatever object he decided to throw in my direction. The last night was no different. I barely managed to barricade myself inside my room, but not before being hit by a big slab of wood in the back that he had torn from a piece of furniture. I sat on the floor and held my back against my bed, staring towards the wall. I wished I had the ability to express some sort of feeling, but I was numb, since this was a situation I was in for the dozenth time in the last month. I had been contemplating running away for some time, especially that I was an adult, legally speaking, and I could not help but stare at a certain slab of the wooden floor. I did not party often, and neither did I splurge money on too many things, so most of the money I would get ended up being stashed away under a certain slab of the wooden floor that was out of place. I got up from the ground and spent a few more moments staring around the room, and, like every time I'd contemplate disappearing from that place, realized there was not much keeping me nailed there. This time, the pain from the wooden slab that my father had thrown in my back seemed to hit differently. I calmly opened my dresser wide, grabbed my backpack from one of the corners of the room and put it on my bed. I threw in a few pairs of jeans and some warm clothes, as it was late September already. I tore out a broken slab from the floor and took the stack of bills from underneath. I split the money in smaller stacks and stuffed it in my pockets and different parts of my backpack. I started my computer and performed a factory reset. I then opened its case, tore the hard disk out, and slammed it against the floor as hard as I could, just to be sure there wouldn't be anything left my father could use to track me down. I looked at the clock on the wall and saw it was just after 9 p.m. Knowing I couldn't leave without sparking another fight, I decided to wait until late enough for my father to be asleep. I started walking restlessly between the corners of the room, still not entirely convinced that I was making the right decision. I couldn't help but remember the times when we were a normal, happy family, and a lot of memories from the time my mother's death flooded my mind. I could barely stop myself from hitting myself compulsively due to the pressure. I continued to rush through the room and cycled between wanting to leave in that very moment and deciding to stay and give my father the third last chance for that month. I felt overwhelmed, and even the idea of putting an end to my life crossed my mind. Though suddenly, however, the chaos in my mind came to an abrupt stop and a numb clarity ensued. I knew that I could not realistically hope to stay in that house without causing myself further suffering. I looked once again at the clock and realized I had been lost in my thoughts for a good 2 hours, and that my clothes were almost drenched in sweat from constantly moving around restlessly. I grabbed the backpack and threw it on my back, checked once more to see if I had took the money, took my phone from my desk and headed towards the door. I slowly removed the nightstand and other random objects I had barricaded the door with in order to create as little noise as possible. I opened the door and my heart froze when it creaked. I stood still for a few seconds in the silence and continued slowly walking down the hallway until I reached the stairs leading to the living room at the ground floor. The wooden stairs were old and noisy, regardless of how lightly I tried to step. The weight of the backpack I was carrying didn't help either, as just as I was about to go down the last few steps, I heard a door open violently upstairs. I started running towards the entrance, and in the panic, I slammed myself against the door. I tried to open it, but realized it was locked. I sprinted towards a certain cabinet in the living room, where I knew the keys were usually kept, grabbed them, and turned back towards the main entrance. The lights were suddenly turned on, and I saw my father with his hands raised around his chest, as if he was trying to block me. "Where the hell do you think you're going? You come here, right now!" he screamed as he started rushing towards me. Fueled by adrenaline, I managed to duck and use my right hand to push him away, and he stumbled all the way across the room. This gave me enough time to run to the door, put a key inside the lock, and open it. I left the house and started sprinting down the road. "You can't just run from me. Where are you even going to go?" I heard a loud scream from behind that sounded like it was from the top of his lungs. I wanted to shout back something in defiance, but my legs kept on running. I didn't know if he was following me, and I didn't want to take my chances by stopping and looking behind. I ran down the street, then turned left and right on as many side streets as I could. I only stopped when I eventually ran out of breath and my lungs felt like they were burning. I took a seat on the curb of the street and spent a few good minutes trying to breathe normally again. After my breathing started to resemble some sort of normalcy, I started looking around, panicked. I stared for a while in all directions until I was certain that I hadn't been followed. I was in one of the quiet neighborhoods from my town, and the streets were dimly lit by a few weak streetlights. There wasn't any movement at all on the street, and the silence gave me the courage to get up from the curb and start walking further. I realized I still had my phone in my pocket, so I took it out in panic, performed another quick factory reset, and threw it in a random yard, because I knew how easy it would be to be tracked through it. I was aware that I had no destination in mind and no real safe place to go, but I couldn't get myself to call my best friend that late in the night and tell him what happened. I decided to save him the panic and contact him the following day, but I couldn't simply walk around the town for the entire night, as I was already quite tired. I knew that at the edge of the town there was a small forest that some people would go for walks in during the day that was fairly isolated. I walked slowly for what seemed to be about half an hour until I reached the edge of the town and the entrance to the forest. I had to find a place to sleep, So I walked past a few lines of trees and started looking around for a larger bush to use as cover. I stumbled through the grass and tree roots until I saw a thicker bush. I opened my backpack and dragged out the 2 blankets I had crumpled inside. I placed one of them on the ground, put my backpack at one of its edges to use as a pillow, and used the other blanket to cover myself. The clothes I was wearing were thick, but lying almost completely still on the ground in a late September night soon started to take its toll. As much as I tried to roll myself tighter inside the blankets, I was still cold, and the shyest sounds startled me. The whole night consisted of sleeping in rounds of 10 to 20 minutes, only to be constantly awakened by the faint sound of a car driving in the distance, or just by the cold breeze of a gust of wind. I kept following the cycle over and over again until I could finally see the first rays of sunlight coming through the branches of the trees. I rolled out of the blankets and got up. I barely managed to start moving, as my entire back was sore from lying on the hard ground for so long. I crumpled the blankets back into my already overfilled backpack and started slowly walking towards the edge of the forest again. Despite constantly stretching and moving my back muscles, the soreness wouldn't just go away, and I couldn't walk too fast without some part of my body aching. My first instinct was to grab my phone in order to call Andrew, one of my closest friends, but realized I got rid of it the night before. My only option was to go directly to his house, so I started slowly dragging myself down the roads until the opposite corner of the town where he lived. The more I walked, my stomach started protesting, and I realized I hadn't eaten in almost an entire day since my father's outburst canceled dinner. I let out a sigh of relief when I finally reached the street Andrew lived on. I walked to his house, jumped the tiny picket fence, and stopped in front of the door. I waited for a few moments and looked around to see if his parents' car was parked anywhere near. I didn't see it, so I started knocking. I got no response for a few moments, so I stretched my hand again to knock louder, only for the door to suddenly open. "Mark, what are you doing here? Why didn't you call and tell me you're coming by?" Andrew asked after he stared at me for a few moments, probably confused by my multiple layers of clothing and huge backpack. "You know my dad's schemes from the past few months. It happened again, and it wasn't nice." "I think that explains the backpack," he said and smirked for a brief moment. "Yeah, I had to leave. I was wondering if—" "Oh, sorry, come in. You can tell me the rest inside." He interrupted me and signaled me to enter the house. I followed him to his living room, dropped my backpack on the floor, and crashed on the couch. "Damn, sure as hell beats sleeping on the ground," I said and let out a laugh. Andrew looked at me confused, so I decided to explain the events of the previous night. Unsurprisingly, he scolded me for deciding to wait out the night in the forest and not calling him right away, but I didn't want to put him in an awkward position in front of his whole family. I assured him I wouldn't try to go back to my father's place, after which he seemed calmer. "Wait, you must be hungry, right?" he asked, but turned around and left the room before I could come up with a polite rejection. "Here, we made too big of a breakfast anyway," he said moments after, as he was coming back to the living room with a huge plate in one hand and a jar in the other. He put the plate and the jar on the small table in front of his couch, and I noticed he'd brought some jam and a big pile of pancakes. I was starving and didn't think twice before going through what seemed like half a dozen pancakes in a matter of minutes. "Looks like I was right," he said and smiled as I was swallowing the last piece of the final pancake on the plate. "Yeah, I let the stomach do the thinking for me. Thanks. I probably should have left some on the plate. I'm sorry," I replied with a bit of guilt for stuffing myself right in front of him with what was left of his breakfast. My stomach was protesting my decision to eat a day's worth of food within a few moments, but I did my best to ignore it and continued trying to find a solution with Andrew. I did not have the slightest idea about where I was supposed to go and what kind of temporary place I can use as a home. I didn't want to repeat the experience in the forest either, so I asked Andrew to hand me his phone so I can find some cheap hotel in the area. He didn't seem to approve of my idea, however, so Andrew insisted I could stay with him for a while. I obviously didn't want to give him or his family a hard time, so I declined. But he insisted to the point where, after a good 30 minutes of contradicting each other, he called his father and explained the situation in detail, so there was little room left for me to negotiate. I accepted to stay for a while and promised I'd only stick around for 2 or 3 days until I could find a decent place to rent. I did a little math and figured the money was enough to last me about 2 months, which was enough for me to get some sort of income. I knew that I'd probably have to interrupt my university studies, which bothered me, but I had a strange sensation of freedom that I hadn't really felt before.